Hello, North Country. Welcome back to Waite Innovate, a North Volume's weekly podcast series. My name is Matthew Waite. I'm going to be your host for the next hour or so. We are here with Lindsay Boulrice. This is the 42nd installment of Waite Innovate, brought to you by North Volume Media. For our listeners, if you haven't done so already, we would obviously advocate you go to your website, write it down. Check us out at northvolume.com. We're also providing videos. Hi to our viewers, and thanks for our listeners for coming back. So, again, the tag here at Waite Innovate, for our listeners who aren't familiar, we are highlighting the voices of activists, artists, organizers, citizens working to move our region forward, and Lindsay is very much doing that. So welcome to the show, Lindsay.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just do a little brief background before we get into the meat and potatoes here. So Lindsay Boulrice is a real estate agent. She was, I believe, with Coldwell Banker for about 3 years.
Yep.
Recently has innovated and moved over to the Z Group of Zach Lattonville fame. So we obviously want to talk about that. So let's get into it then. As our listeners are probably familiar, we try and highlight North Country talent, so North Country upbringing. So I believe you are from the North Country, born and raised.
Yes, I am.
Tell us a little bit about that. So Ellenburg.
Ellenburg. So I grew up in the deep north, so I didn't have a ton of neighbors, so it was kind of tree climbing and playing in rivers and throwing rocks and seeing where things go.
Yeah, because some people joke Plattsburgh's the middle of nowhere, but we can actually find some places like Ellenburg, which are a little bit more the middle of nowhere. I mean,
Yeah,
just going over
absolutely.
to St. Lawrence County, pretty rural area. So talk about that. You said sounds like you were just kind of doing the farm and stream thing, having playing with your friends. So talk about some of the things you were up to as a little tyke.
So I grew up with an older brother, and he was about 5 years older than me, so he was a major influence on me. And then when I was younger, your closest really good friend lived probably 15, 20 minutes away. So there was no walking to each other's houses, anything like that. So you had to physically get in cars or have your parents drive you. So it was just a lot of playing outside and
Biking?
getting dirty and, biking, doing anything you can.
All right, awesome. So Ellenburg, NAC, I think some of our listeners might know, known for soccer.
Yep.
Were you playing any sports back in the day in high school?
I did. So I played soccer and softball, and I cheered throughout
All
all
right.
of high school.
And I think so. The soccer programs were typically pretty successful. Did you
Yes.
guys have some wins under your belt there?
Yeah, so the soccer team that I was on was actually pretty good. Made it through Final Four through states a couple of times. I don't know that I necessarily contributed to that. I was a pretty average soccer player, but it was definitely part of the team, and it was fun. It was a great
Yeah.
experience.
What positions did you play?
I did some defense mostly, and then I did a lot of, I guess, offense towards the end, just because I can run pretty well.
Yeah, awesome. So it sounds like probably defense to start, and then like, oh yeah, well you got some pretty interesting anaerobic abilities. You're able
Yeah.
to be out there and to run for long periods of time, and that was kind of my thing. I started at the front trying to score goals, and they're like, well, this guy actually is running pretty well, so why don't you do more work and play some defense for
Yeah.
us? So that's awesome. And cheerleading, I think you also had some successes there. So pretty good squad.
Yes. So our team was pretty close too. We had pretty, I would say that it was pretty consistent throughout the 4 years that we really did the cheer squad. It was all the same members through most of it. So when you're with a group of people for that long, you just kind of learn how to adjust to them and learn their traits and so forth. So 1 year we ended up winning CVAC, which is the local competition for the county. And then after that, I think we took second my senior year.
So I know some of our listeners may be thinking cheerleading, is that a sport? Is that not a sport? I tend to fall on the side of it is a sport because just look at some of the things that you're doing athletically and with, holding people up and just the amount of athletic ability and also preparation that it takes to go into that. Where do you fall?
Yeah. So it's definitely, I would agree that it is a sport just because there is a lot more physical activity that's involved that people don't really understand. And it seems silly, but even if you kind of essentially, like if you're lifting weights, it's strengthening all your muscles, and it really kind of is difficult to hit all the right moves at the right time. And then doing the lifting portion too, we throw people in the air. So to catch them, it's very important, and we're throwing humans in the air, so they can be 130 pounds. So it definitely takes a group effort as well as some physical strength to do that. And it definitely teaches a lot of patience as well. So.
Yeah. All right, great. And then obviously we're here in the North Country. We had maybe not our first snow of the year, but today it snowed a little bit. So as we transition here into winter, were there things in Ellenburg that you did during the winter to keep yourself busy?
So I grew up on a river, and it would freeze over during obviously the winter time. So we would
Most winters, if
most
not everyone.
yeah. So being a river, it would actually it would freeze over pretty thoroughly. So we would scrape off all the snow on it, and it would actually give us some pretty good ice. So we would skate around, and we would actually play hockey, and that kind of more or less led to me being the little sister taking slap shots in the net. But it was good. It was
Were you any good at hockey?
Not really. I was just more a decoy.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about going to college. So at some point, you're having a lot of fun in high school. I imagine your grades were pretty good, and we'll talk about some of the opportunities you had. You made Dean's List, I think, at Plattsburgh State. So obviously, we're very involved in academics as well. So did you know at that point in high school that you wanted to go on to college? When did that start to develop?
Yes, I'm pretty sure, like most people my age, it was kind of instilled that we necessarily had to. So it wasn't, everybody kind of wanted to at that time. So I knew that I was going to go, but I'm a pretty good procrastinator. So I waited until really the last minute to figure out where I was going to go.
Well, we've had some pretty impressive procrastinators on here. Not only myself, but Giovannina Bucci. So maybe we'll have to talk about that. Certainly I come from that example. So it took you a while before making the choice. Then what kind of options were you mulling?
So I wanted to stay probably mostly in New York State at the time, and that was just based off of my mom just wanting me to kind of stay close enough where if anything happened, then I was able to come home and not have to take a plane to get there. So I looked all across New York State. So Binghamton, Buffalo, Ithaca, Utica, Albany, and St. Rose, where I ultimately ended up going for the first year.
Okay, so how many did you actually apply to in that whole?
I think all of them.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. So,
you wanted to keep your options open.
Yeah, I didn't know. So I applied prior to actually visiting the campuses. So those are the ones that I got, I think, accepted to. And that was obviously quite a few. So we kind of just did like a road trip one time of 3 days just to go out and take a look, and ended up in Albany. So
you ended up with a private school. What was the discussion between private versus public? Did you visit any? I mean, what was it about St. Rose that kind of stood out?
So I went to school my first year for biochem, was what I transitioned into. So being in a larger school, even though SUNY Albany does have a really good biochemistry program, I kind of wanted a smaller classroom just in case I needed to ask questions and so forth. And that actually was very beneficial because you knew your professors, you knew your classmates too, so you can all kind of collaborate and understand and learn together. So being in a smaller structure ended up being great for that major.
Yeah, definitely the opposite of my experience at University at Buffalo, which is much more of the, I think I've joked about this, kind of the assembly line, a way of education of just packing huge amounts of students into big lecture halls your first couple years. And then eventually, when you figure out what you want to do, there's smaller classes, more hands-on, but a much different experience, I'm guessing, than St. Rose, which is, my wife went to St. Rose for graduate school, speaks very highly of it. Yep. Small little place there in the middle of Albany. So
yeah, it's beautiful, actually. St. Rose was a great college to go to. And like what you're saying with the assembly style, too, when I transferred back here for my sophomore year to Plattsburgh State, and that's how it was. It was assembly style for your primary biochem classes, where there was 300 people in there. And if you had a question, sometimes you just had to look it up.
So biochemistry, that is no joke. As someone who started my undergrad experience in an engineering program, you obviously have to know your sciences. Did you enjoy science in high school?
I did, yep.
What was it about science that drew you?
Well, I had a big influence from my brother because he's an animal scientist now, and he taught me a lot of biology when we were growing up. But I don't know, it would just kind of made sense. So I actually really enjoyed physics when I was in high school as well, and that was my senior year class, so I kind of just got in the groove of that and continued it into my next couple of years.
All right. So eventually, I think you did end up coming back to Plattsburgh.
Yep.
What were some of the reasons behind that? Just kind of wanted to be closer to family?
Yeah, I came back just for family purposes.
So, all right. And very good. And were you able to transfer the credits and everything? How did that work out?
Yeah, there was a couple that didn't come because they were more focused on private school. Like I had to take an ethics course, actually, for being a Catholic school at St. Rose. But most of them came over and they were fine.
And then at Plattsburgh, you stuck with the biochem program for a little while at least?
I did, yep. And actually, that was one of the transitions was at St. Rose, they were a little more intense about their program. So when I transferred back into Plattsburgh State, some of the second-year classes were actually things I'd already covered in my first year at St. Rose, so it was a little beneficial.
Oh, excellent.
Yep.
And then eventually, though, I think there was talk about the experience that may have left you to exit stage left for the biochem degree. Because I looked at your resume and I didn't see a biochem degree there. So
No.
Let's talk about that transition.
So it was my junior year of school, and I had started working in a pharmacy because I knew I wanted to do something in the medical field. I just hadn't really zoned in on exactly what it was going to be. And I did not like the pharmacy. So it was just a matter of not necessarily feeling like I was in the right place at the right time. and I had went to a career fair. And at the time, I had been working in restaurants and stuff just as a waitress, making tips, and obviously through college. So I walked through the career fair, and there was this big, beautiful display of the Sagamore Resort in Lake George. So, and the people that were demonstrating it also were really friendly and open, and they had beautiful pictures and great conversation. And so that kind of just struck me in the right way. So I decided that was going to be what I wanted to do. So I switched to hospitality actually for my junior year and did the full degree within the 2 years. And then my first job right out of school was actually at the Sagamore.
Oh, wow. That worked. That was interesting. I mean, we talked with Dean Archer about
Yeah.
kind of materializing things and visualizing the
Yep.
whole secret thing. Do you think there was a
Oh,
bit of
yes.
that?
Yes. So I actually just finished The Secret again. I read it when I was 16. And I actually just finished last week rereading it. And I think that there's something to say about that. I think that when you are really focused on something,
Manifesting.
it
I'm
naturally
sorry,
comes to you.
manifestation.
Yep.
That's fascinating stuff. So you very much feel that actually did work and helped you kind of transition. I mean,
Yeah.
with where you are now, it seems very serendipitous. At the time, did you feel like it was meaningful?
Yes, absolutely. So,
All right.
and it was exciting as I think I was 20. Don't know if I was 21 yet when I graduated. I think I had just turned 21 when I was graduating college. So to apply to essentially your dream job at that time and then get that phone call that they wanted you to come work for you was awesome. Ultimately, it couldn't get any better at the time. So
Yeah, I mean, I can't say I've had the pleasure yet of visiting the Sagamore.
Oh, it's
Hoping,
beautiful.
fingers
You should.
crossed.
Yeah.
Yeah, same with the Mirror Lake Inn, but there's just some beautiful, beautiful resorts in upstate New York. So, what did you learn about hospitality going through that process in the program?
So, what hospitality will teach you is patience mostly, and then it also
Well, then I'm done. Was not my field then.
secondhandly, it'll teach you how to maintain grace under fire. And I think people don't really realize that with the restaurant industry in general. If you're managing, there's a lot of behind the scenes work that happens that you kind of have to control, and you have to be a little more forward thinking and anticipate bad things happening and be able to prevent them from happening. And that actually parlays into real estate as well. So.
Yeah, and before we do make that transition, that whole grace under fire thing is interesting. I obviously am very clearly figuring out why that was not for me, because the two things you mentioned are not certainly within my wheelhouse. But I think it's interesting, the grace under fire aspect of it, because I think it's a cliche, the customer's always right. We hear that. I've always been like, well, no, the customer very often is just kind of mean, right? But I think the point is that you have to be accommodating, and you very much learn some of that. So what are some skills that you think you learned that help you with that? Patience, were you already a pretty patient person?
No, I would say I'm still pretty impatient actually, but you can, under the right circumstances, you kind of have to be. So while doing that, I learned how to just take the right hits and learn how to react and be less reactive to the situation, and learn how to, just kind of assimilate and make the experience better for everybody else, even though sometimes it's hard pill to swallow for yourself. That's what you're there for, is to make it a good experience for other people.
Yeah, so do you do anything to help that with the coping skills? Take a deep breath? Do you do meditating, things like that?
Yeah, yep.
Okay, cool. So let's transition then into the real world. Eventually we all have to do that. If, unless we're very talented, can play sports, or are artists playing music for their entire careers. But what was your transition? Sounds like at some point during college you were working in the pharmacy.
Yep.
Eventually got into more of the server, bartender, hospitality industry. Talk about that transition. What were some of your early forays into that, early jobs?
So I'm trying to think of how this actually played out. So I was at the Sagamore for a while, and then I had a friend's mom had needed some help doing a catering business, so I came back up to the North Country to do that. And then from there, I was still doing biochem because I was through college. Actually, no, that was after college. So I'm trying to think of how I would go. So the next job after the catering one was commercial leasing through the mall. So that was a difficult job. It's very difficult to convince people to come into malls, especially, only 5 years ago when people kind of thought the mall was a dying industry. So, but that was
I think
nice
today
for sales.
we're still seeing that to a certain extent,
Yeah,
right? I
yep.
mean, so you came in a very difficult time to where I think the writing was almost on the wall for malls, and that's
Yeah.
probably why it was such a difficult job. But you probably learned something in having to work so much harder to be able to bring those tenants in. So talk about a little bit about that.
So first of all, that was my first real sales job, because other than that, I'd been like a server before, and I didn't actually bartend until a little later. But
Those sales typically are a little easier, right? They come to you.
yeah. But that one you had to go out and explore, and you actually had to go to different states and kind of try to cultivate the business and convince them. So it was kind of nice because that's how I learned how to do some of my sales pitching and so forth. And
Cold calling and some very difficult things. I mean.
Yep. And so after I actually took that job with the anticipation that I wanted to be a realtor, because I've wanted to be a realtor since I was a little kid. So, but however, most people told me that until I had a family and until I was, midlife and had experiences and owned my own house and all those things, that I wouldn't be a good realtor. So I actually took the job for the commercial leasing with the anticipation that I wanted to see if I could sell stuff. And I ended up doing a couple years there, and it worked out. So I just made the transition, and that was just my test drive.
Yeah, so that's interesting then. So your entire youth, you kind of had a goal. You knew what you wanted to do, and I guess circuitously eventually made your way into that industry.
Yep.
Fascinating stuff. So let's talk about the realty aspect of it then. What are some of the differences in sales from, let's say, commercial space to a home?
Okay, so with commercial, typically there is no emotions involved. It's all strictly numbers. Is this going to be lucrative for my business? Is the placement good? And then on residential side, it's entirely emotional. So buying and selling are both at a very emotional experience. And that was one of the things that kind of drew me to real estate, is that I wanted to be able to actually help the families with that, because they can go into full-blown panic mode pretty quick. So, and that's a big part of it, is making sure that you're kind of a therapist and knowing how to calm them down and tell them this is not the first time that this has happened, and just kind of transition them into understanding that the goal is in sight.
Yeah, and I think on a couple levels, I hadn't thought about it as intricately, as deeply as you're alluding to now, and I'm glad you're here so we can talk about this stuff, because that's true, because a home, I mean, you're essentially buying a place to protect your family, and to build a family and to build a home. Hopefully a house becomes a home, that whole thing. But also, most people only buy one, maybe two houses in their lifetime. So to talk about that from an emotional perspective, I mean, you kind of have to get it right.
Yes. So that's one of the very interesting things about real estate as well, is you kind of get to see people through their transitions of life. So I've even actually today, just before this, I closed a home. I represented the seller, and I actually just sold this to them about a year ago. So, and they are now going to upgrade and get a larger home in the future, because the woman ended up getting pregnant, and now the house is a little bit too small for them. So being able to see that, and the same thing for people who are selling their houses, generally they either are going to downsize because they're empty nesters, or maybe they got a job opportunity someplace else. And both, any kind of scenario that people are selling their houses, there is an emotional experience behind it. So if somebody is going to leave and take a job opportunity across the country, they've already made memories in those homes, and it's sad to see them. And sometimes you walk in and it seems silly and kind of hallmarky to see the kids' height differences on the door rails and whatever the case may be, but they've lived there, and people are really attached to those things. And it's funny, because I've walked into houses before, and the frames and the molding are taken off the doors because they're bringing those with them, the child's height scales.
Yeah, no, very, very cool. So, and that's one of the things, obviously. Let's talk about the transition then to the Z Group.
Yep.
Zach Lattenville was on the program. Incredible young entrepreneur, local businessman, just has a vision and is really putting it to the test and bringing in a great team. And that's why we wanted to bring in you to talk about some of this, because he's doing some things that I think are really, really innovative. And there's some technology aspect I'll talk to, but also just innovating socially, which we like to talk about. And I think it's exactly to your point there of the emotional aspect. Zach, very clearly from my perspective being around him, is he takes this very seriously, and he wants to find the right fit. It's not just about a quick sale, making a buck. It's, I want to be in it for the long haul. I want to, provide you with a house that's going to be the foundation for a family. So talk about, is that something that you talked about when you wanted to come on, or how did the whole transition take place? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So I agree with that, as far as how Zach's approaches and his innovation with that as well. So when I was younger, my dad was a carpenter, so we were always working on our own home with my family. My mom and my dad and my brother were all pretty involved with that stuff. Even from a young age, I was helping reshingle the roof at 12. So I was very involved with all that stuff. And then my parents owned a duplex too, and that was an older 1800s home, so that constantly needed repairs. So I knew what it's like.
You were on the roof at 12 years old?
I was reshingling at 12, yes. Yeah, I was more of the shingle holder than the actual,
I figured as much, but
I was up there. So
takes a village, right? I mean,
yeah, absolutely. I was free labor, so it worked out. But then, so with that, I understood that there's an emotional experience and emotional connection to homes. So that was my approach into real estate from the beginning. And then Zach never actually approached me with attempts to draft me. I kind of saw that too with his newer marketing approach, and he was just doing things that were a little different. And actually, if I remember correctly, Zach and I initial conversation wasn't even based off of real estate. He does the woodworking stuff and I bake. So we kind of both are pretty passionate about our hobbies, and we both do that for our clients. So when he sells a house, he gives them a really cool cutting board that's really beautiful, and I'll make them cupcakes. So we kind of had that where there's our personal touch within our sales as well, and we both care about our clients. So that's important, and I think that is a very important aspect to the Z Group itself, is that we're not trying to sell you a house to make commission or make $1 million and be rich and famous. It's more in the capacity that we actually care about you. And in the end, we want to create a relationship. We want to be invited to your wedding, and I wanted to know if you were going to have a baby in a couple months. So it's all about creating relationships rather than just trying to get a quick buck.
Yeah, very well stated. And I love the personal touch aspect. And obviously, I was going to mention that with Zach, that's another way I think he's innovating, is that personal touch and creating a different cutting board for each individual house based, I'm sure, on how he feels about that and the interaction. I didn't know that about yourself, the baking aspect too.
Yeah.
So cupcakes usually?
I do cupcakes for my clients. I do pretty elaborate cakes for people when they want them. So I actually just started baking in the beginning of this year, in about January. And it's funny because when I was growing up, I used to do like breads and I would bake a lot. But this is when I just recently started getting pretty good at it and pretty intricate at it. I took a passion for it. But as this year progressed and I was making these cakes, it was my family members from my more extended family, my cousins, were reaching out to me, and they were like, we thought you were going to be a baker when you grew up, because when you were little, you used to make all these cakes and like cupcakes and all pastries and stuff. And it's just funny how it kind of I collaborated the two.
Yeah, so innovating, right? I mean, doing many things, and I love that. So we'll get back to that because I do want to touch on that aspect of it. But just to finish up on the innovative standpoint from Zach, I mean, the thing we talked about that's really interesting to me is the aspect of drones. Is that part of I think you mentioned his social media campaign and how it's maybe a little different. Can you touch on that a little bit? What are some of the things you see him doing in social media, innovating, that drew you to the Z Group?
So the drone work, we do drones for every seller, which is great. It helps with a different perspective when you can see an aerial shot of the house. And it just creates another element when you can see the drone coming down the street too. Like Zach has a listing right now, and his is on Kelvin, and I have one on Grace, where they're both beautiful streets. So if you are not from this area, it is really nice to be able to see what that neighborhood is kind of like. And with the movies in general, it's actually very nice because people connect with a video more than they connect with pictures. And there's all kinds of statistics and
hi viewers
based on that. So with that, and people want to see who you're kind of talking to as well. So it's a lot easier to tell what kind of personality you have and if I'm going to be the right person for you based off of video.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I absolutely loved the drone conversation with Zach, and I love how you added to it, because I hadn't thought about the neighborhood aspect to it, but now it makes a whole lot more sense, right? Not only can you get, I think we had mentioned during our interview the elderly populations up here. It's a lot of times it's difficult to get out and schlep out and go to a property and visit it. Through the drone footage, you can probably visit 10 different locations in 2 hours.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yep. And it's a different experience to kind of do a walkthrough as well. We do pretty elaborate videoing through, and we have a professional that comes in and does that stuff for us, and we're on tape, which is, it sounds easy, but it's actually very difficult to, get the courage to do that sometimes. But it allows people to kind of see the layout in a different aspect too, rather than just being able to take a look from pictures and try to figure it out, how to piece it together in their mind.
Yeah, does that create any problems with, this house has some shingle work that needs to be done?
It's that's been some of my thoughts before too. Like sometimes it may show the negatives more than what a photo that's been edited could, but that's the risk. I mean, if you show up in person, you're going to see that stuff. So I'd rather that before you get super stoked about coming to see the house and then realize that it may not be what you want.
But that's a transparency aspect too that I think, I mean, Zach, I think we know him pretty well. I don't get the impression from him that he's kind of a shyster, that and that's, I think, what we're doing here and what you're doing is transparency, right? We always talk about transparency and being a good thing, and he's actually bringing that into the profession of, you can see a lot more about this, and I'm showing you all of it, or as much as you want to see. There's no secrets here, kind of a thing. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think we've had lots of conversations based on that too. And if we kind of want to be able to present ourselves, both of us together, that if we're not the right fit for you, that's okay. We want to make sure that our clients are comfortable with coming to us beforehand. So
yeah, let's talk about your clients coming to you beforehand, because as someone who's of the age to where I'm looking to maybe buy a house in the next few years, do you have any suggestions? What are the first couple steps that our listeners should take if they are interested in purchasing a house?
The first thing that I always recommend is just talking to a lender. Typically, your pre-qualification is a pretty quick conversation. So I know that there's a couple lenders that can do a lot of the pre-qualification process based off of a phone call, which is good to know, because I also know with a lot of first-time home buyers that they have a heightened sense of what they can afford. And that's typical for everybody. We all think that because you make a certain value, you can create between X and Y. And typically, it's not really the case. Sometimes you're a little less. And the issue with that is if you think that you can afford a home and that's in the 250 range and you get pumped about it and you're looking on Zillow and you're looking on different medias to see what the 250 homes look like, when you find out that you're only qualified for the 150s, there's a huge difference in what those houses look like. So we want to make sure that your expectations of what you can actually afford and what you're going to get is parallel.
Yeah, no, it just makes me unfortunately think of the whole mortgage crisis in 2008, where it seems like, looking at the history, people were almost, I think it's pretty clear that they were in many cases nudged or almost coerced into fraudulently saying that their income was more than it was, because they wanted, it's like keeping up with the Joneses mentality, right? Like my friends and neighbors are in $250,000 houses that are just buying. I got to be there too. Do you run into that at all, or is that something that the lenders deal with mostly?
No, the lenders typically are the ones that kind of cut it right off. Yeah, which is good for us too, because that's a difficult conversation. But yeah, typically we can kind of spearhead that. I've had to do that before, where even if your client can afford a certain value and they still say, okay, well, let's look at homes at this value and we can just offer less. Typically it doesn't really work out that well. So that is part of the emotional crisis that we have to deal with a lot of buyers, especially new buyers, because they get pumped about stuff, and then you kind of have to be the one that breaks the ice to them. But
so those emotional crises, let's talk about that. So you, I think, did reference the hospitality, very effective with that. How about being a bartender? Is that something? Because I would just imagine that every once in a while you get these individuals that come in with going through their, it's the whole, what bar back, what can I tell you, tell me your story kind of thing. Do you think bartending and some of the odd jobs that you had helped formulate this expertise that you have in dealing with some of this?
Yeah, so I actually still like to bartend. I'm not doing it right now, but I do typically during the summer. I think it's an enjoyable job. That's why I kind of do it still. But I think I heard before, so I think it was a quote from someone, that there's two reasons for people to actually be in the bar. It's because they're either having a good day or they're having a bad day. And as a bartender, it's your job to figure out what it is and ultimately make them leave with being in a good mood. So, and another thing that's kind of different, and people who don't bartend don't really understand this, is that you're on display all the time. So people look to you to kind of be an entertainer to some regard. And it can be a little exhausting, because if you're there for, let's say you're even there for 6 hours, you have to be on all the time, and it can be very exhausting and to socially be talking to people for that long.
Be on your A game.
Yeah.
Can you juggle? I mean,
I know you have to. Sometimes you got to bring in a special skill. And sometimes I'll play bar tricks with the customers, and they're really terrible, but I put them in a better mood, so it works.
That's funny. So I did want to talk about. So we talk about people first getting into the market. Then, so are there demographics that you see in home buyers? Who do you typically see come across your desk? Who's looking for houses? Is there a demographic? Young people?
So I get a pretty good mix, actually. I would say a lot of first-time home buyers, but when people think first-time home buyer, they're under the assumption that it means millennials. And I have several clients that they're buying their first home in their 50s. So it's regardless if you're 20 or if you're 50, the experience is exactly the same. Like, I can almost peg when things are going to happen. I know when something's going to happen. I know the questions that are about to happen. It's very fascinating, because typically it's all pretty consistent. And so as far as like a particular demographic, I wouldn't say that I work with one more than the other. I do get a lot of people my age that come to me just based off of social medias, obviously, and I have a pretty good sphere of influence, so they tend to come to me just because they know who I am.
Yeah, we'll get into the social media aspect, and you're obviously doing some great things out there. But I did want to segue in. You mentioned the millennial aspect, because I do think there's been some disruption, and this is maybe I'll just start with my personal take on it. I think that certainly personally, My wife and I just started looking for a house in the last couple years or so. I'm 36. She's about the same age, a little bit older. And it seems like people similarly situated to me in my age and other demographics, it's taken a lot longer for us to get to the position where we can buy a house, do things like student loan debt,
Yep.
finding a job that pays, keeping up with inflation and wages. And when I came out of law school, it was a time when quite frankly, it was right after the housing crisis, and a lot of different industries, including the legal industry, got devastated by that. And are you seeing any? I mean, basically, what I'm suggesting is that it seems like it's a particularly difficult time to be able to sell homes to certain demographics, and especially millennials. Are you seeing any particular challenges with that demographic?
I don't know. I mean, it's hard to compare to 2008 because I've only been a realtor for about 3.5 years. So since I've started, I haven't really seen that. I know that there are friends that tend to want a home. I've had a couple of times where we start the process a little bit and then we realize that their debt to income may be a little different than what we anticipated originally. So sometimes the buying power isn't necessarily there right away. But that's actually one of the nice features of it getting me involved in the beginning process is being able to cut that expectation where it needs to be. But then as far as, I mean, you're not wrong. I have college debt too, so it is difficult to be able to come back out of that. It ends up being like a little rabbit hole where I think we came from a generation where we kind of expected to go to college and it cost money. So as far as being able to recover from that, I think it's happening, and I will see, I guess, over the next couple of years as well, because I think that our generation also was in this position to kind of necessarily get a master's degree. So that is the next step. Like I know a lot of my friends that did attend college, they have masters as well. I don't have a master's degree, but I know that, that tends to be a lot of the case. So they're still in their college career. And once that's out, they're going to be making more income. So I guess we'll have to wait and see. I mean, right now I do have a lot of clientele that are mid-20s that are buying things, and you would be surprised. There are people that are. One of my first sales was somebody I started at 23. I think she was 21, and she owns her own business, and she bought a house. So that was pretty cool to be able to be 21 and not, have like an established career in a corporate place and be able to buy her own house was pretty exciting.
Yeah, no, there are some young people who have it together. I think Ashley Taylor did something similar to that at the Bagel
absolutely.
Pit.
Yep. She's great.
And yeah, absolutely. I think I'm just speaking personally. I mean, to the whole thing about education, I think, I got my degree in undergrad from University of Buffalo, and, I ended up going into the service industry, hosting and catering, that type of thing. And I essentially kind of had to go back to school to get to where I wanted to be because I'm like, well, I feel like I've got a degree. I wanted to be working a job that, was paying the bills, $50,000, $60,000, and there just wasn't much of that out there. Yeah. So it was almost like had to go back, and my wife was a similar story. She was, we're just working a pretty good job where we met each other, and eventually she wanted to become an SLP and had to go back to school and a master's degree, and it's just I think the job situation and the wages has kind of created a little bit of a lesser buying power that maybe I think is frustrating millennials, but sounds like you're not saying that millennials are destroying the housing market.
No, I wouldn't say so. I think we did definitely contribute. I bought my house too, so there's ways to make it happen. I mean, unfortunately, sometimes it's not the most exciting way to get things done, but there's approaches, and sometimes it just means that you stay in a little more and save up money in different regards. So.
Yeah, no, I wish I had started the job a little bit earlier and had a little bit more equity when I did this. But, looking back, we all have small mini regrets. But otherwise, doing pretty well here. So let's talk about the need for a realtor, because obviously I'm sure you have some thoughts on that, because a lot of people probably just say, what do I need a realtor for? I'll just put it on the market. It's going to sell. People see it. So tell our listeners, what are some of the benefits they get when they go to the Z Group and they have a Lindsay Boulrice be the realtor?
So the Z Group in whole, I would say that our marketing is just different and it's interesting, and I think that stands out. So that's definitely beneficial on the selling side. And as far as just using a realtor in general, a lot of the people don't really understand the amount of confrontation that actually goes on behind the scenes. So I've actually had friends that we originally were kind of looking at homes together, and then they ended up going to a for sale by owner that I couldn't convince to work with me, which is fine. Sometimes that happens. And then at the end of the experience, my original buyers came back to me and they said, we wish that we would have used you because we didn't realize the paperwork, the chaos, the mental struggle that you have to go through. So it really can be a pretty exhausting experience if you don't have somebody that does this regularly. And again, back to the emotional aspect of buying and selling a house.
That's exactly where I was going.
Yeah,
So
it's very emotional for a buyer, because when they find a house, sometimes you go through 30 houses. And if you find that house that you want it. And sometimes that seller doesn't necessarily want to sell it to you at that price, and they have an emotional connection to it as well. So dealing with both sets, that's where we come in, and it's because you won't actually deal with them directly, and you know how to calm down, or I know how to calm down buyers or the sellers on both ends. So it's being able to cut out I'm an intermediary for confrontation.
well, as a criminal defense attorney, I'm very much in that same
Yes,
field.
absolutely.
So yeah, it just makes me think of there's, and I'm gonna have a note on that. There's an old saying in matrimonial law that the basically it's a good deal when nobody's happy, right?
Yeah.
That's a fair deal is when no one walks away happy. Is it somewhat similar to that? Or I mean, obviously you push the emotional aspect in a much more positive way.
Yeah.
With the cutting board and with the cakes and make it much more of a home. But I imagine there's some of that too, right? When there's that impasse of, because listen, as we referenced, if you're most people buy or sell a home once or twice in their life. If you are selling your home, a lot of times you put a lot of equity in there, and that's probably, I think, most of your clients, their biggest investment they're ever going to make is a home. So you're really thinking, well, I need this for my retirement, et cetera. And if you're getting the home, it's, well, I can't bankrupt this because I'm obviously trying to build a family. So it sounds like the benefit, the biggest benefit of having realtors is someone who could be there in the middle and work through those very difficult emotional issues, the paperwork, et cetera, and just not tax you to the point where you just become physically and emotionally exhausted with the process.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, too, I think that most of my clients have ended the deal on a good note and been pretty happy. Of course, you're going to get some clients that just aren't, but I think that really at the end of the day, buyers are just excited about getting their house too, even if it may not be exactly the deal that they wanted originally. They're still excited about what's to come. And on the selling regard, those people are selling for a reason. So whatever their next step in life is, they may not have gotten the price that they were looking for, but at the end of the day, they still have to get to that end goal. So it's either sell your house at that maybe a little bit less price, or you don't sell it. So sometimes at the end of the day, you just kind of have to take that hit. But
so necessity ends up pushing it forward generally. Okay, so I've been hearing that it's a seller's market. Can you speak to that?
Yes. So as far as when I started 3 years ago, it was a buyer's market. And then recently it just switched about, I would say, mid last year. So inventory was really low for a long time. And when that happens, it becomes a seller's market because the demand and the supply are not on par.
Classic supply and demand.
Yep. So when you have a very low supply, people will pay a little more to do that. So
okay, so we're seeing, I guess, a little bit low inventory, so the supply is lower. You got places like Norsk and other places that are coming in with high earning employees. So is that the crunch that we're seeing? A little bit higher demand, a little bit less supply, and so prices are going up a little bit more. So if you're selling a house, good time to be doing that.
Yes.
Buying a house, you have to be a little bit more selective, perhaps.
Yeah, I would say that. I mean, ultimately, be a little leery as a buyer. Just make sure that what you're getting is worth what you're paying for. But I think ultimately, it's actually been pretty beneficial to the area as far as on an economical approach. So.
Well, let's talk about that because there is, historically, I think I mentioned that your home is the biggest investment that one will ever make. So can you talk a little bit about that aspect of, is a home still a good investment? I'm sure a lot of our listeners are wondering that.
Yep. I will argue 100 times over that buying a home is the best thing that you could do. You're either going to pay somebody else's mortgage or you're going to be paying your own. And you're obtaining an asset. So at the end of the day, even if you have to move or if you outgrow your house or whatever it may be, even at the end of the day, when you have to sell your house, and if it's, let's say it's a little lower than what you were expecting, it's still you're still accumulating all that wealth. So I can, there's pride in home ownership as well that just can't be argued.
All right, so no shock here that a realtor is very much in favor of
really.
of buying a home as an investment. No, but no, I think historically that bears out that typically the housing market has gone up. Obviously, you see blips every once in a while, like 2008, which I'm sure some people really got caught on the wrong end of that. But ultimately, historically, home, good investment. So
of course.
And of course, our listeners check out some links. Maybe we'll provide some. I'm sure you can call or email the Z Group and have any questions. Beautiful. So let's talk about some of your goals here. So I think you mentioned that at the end of the day, you wanted to sell real estate. So you're kind of at where you want to be. Is that fair to say? So
Yeah.
at this point, what are the goals? What are the markers that you kind of say, this is what I'm hoping to do in the next 3, 4, or 5 years?
So I've always kind of wanted to be, and it was a slow start as far as being able to figure out how to do that. I had to come in my own and figure out how to be a good realtor before I could do really anything else. But being innovative is also one of the things I was really kind of trying to do when I first started my career as well. And then being able to collaborate with Zach definitely was beneficial. He's very innovative and he has good ideas all the time, and we're always bouncing off each other. And just between the two of us, we're constantly texting each other about our marketing and saying, how'd you do that? Like, we want to know. And that's actually kind of nice because it's instead of a competition between the two of us, it's a companionship, which is really nice. But then as far as like my long-term goals, I want to be able to help benefit the Z Group and just kind of be a part of something else that stands out a little differently. We want people to come to us because we're comfortable and have good marketing and continue to learn how to market and grow. I mean, it's awesome. But we're be able to work with people like Damian Battinelli and so
Who's
forth.
he?
And,
Just kidding.
and
We love you, Damian.
They're all forward thinkers, and it's great to be a part of
Absolutely.
a community that can be a part of them.
And that's one of the things I love here about North Volume is just the collaboration that we're seeing. And Zach's been a great part of that. On the aspect of marketing, I just saw Zach put out a silhouette, which was beautiful. The Z Group, New York, the silhouette of the Plattsburgh skyline in the background. So I guess our listeners will be looking forward to that. But I think that's what you're alluding to, right? This. Did you have any thoughts on that? Did you, who?
Yeah, he ran it by me before, but it's it works out. It's always good. He always try to mix things up. So.
Yeah, so more to come from the Z Group, so we'll be looking forward to that. So let's talk about the social media marketing aspect.
Okay,
You're very, very involved with that.
Yep.
You have your own Facebook.
I do.
Talk about that part of the marketing, because sales is historically it's always been a little bit of a very personal aspect of either in person or face to face. But now the internet is kind of, I believe, changing that to a certain extent, right? You're most likely doing a lot of marketing online that I'm guessing people late 2000s or 30 years ago weren't doing. So talk about that transition and how has that worked for you?
So I came into a time when social media marketing was very important. I can see it now that we really need it. We have to step up we've been doing that, but you have to be very involved on social media to get any attention. It's about being top of mind, and if you're not, you fall to the wayside. So I do a lot of personal research on Instagram, even like hashtags and different marketing approaches. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out new ways to be kind of innovative and think of different camera angles and maybe video tactics, things like that, that kind of makes us interesting. So sometimes it's finding, like with the cakes that I do and like the woodworking that Zach does too, sometimes you can put that on your business page and do like a hashtag that's based off of baking, and then you pull in an entirely different demographic that it will also see you be a realtor. So we kind of want to have that on our social media aspect as well, that we're real people, and we want people to know that our interests are a part of our lives and that we are real people. So learning how to keep up and be one step ahead is very interesting. And I think that actually in this area that tends to fall a little bit. I think that unless you're really going out there and trying to be innovative with marketing, it's hard to get caught up in the everyday rift of being just a regular realtor. And it almost is a full-time job just to think about the new marketing tactics, and that makes sense why there's marketing departments. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's kind of shocking. We had Tom McNichols. I don't know how he does it. I don't know if you're familiar with Tom, but not only is he an accomplished singer, he also has the Wood Lab, and he is a real estate agent out of the city. So
unbelievable how some people do all the stuff they do.
He's crazy, but check out that episode. That's a really interesting one. But let's segue here into some very interesting things that you do in your spare time.
Yes.
Beekeeping. I did not know about this. I did some research before and didn't come across this. So talk about that hobby.
I'm a beekeeper, so I've been doing that also about 3 years, and I actually became a beekeeper to help save the environment because it's very, very necessary. And my brother is an animal scientist, and when I was growing up, he really tried to instill biology in me, and we were always just talking about that kind of stuff. Naturally, he's 5 years older than me, so when he was going through college and going through biology programs, he was always coming home and teaching me this stuff, which was cool and very influential for me. So I always found beekeeping to be an interesting hobby, but it's not like gardening. Like we're working with, sometimes 20,000, 30,000 bees in one hive. So it can be a little intimidating. And when I was reading about it, I actually just started reading a couple books about them, and you don't really have to be. And I had my best friend's uncle actually came up to me one day and said, "Here, try this," and it was a spoonful of honey. And I was like, "This is so cool. How'd you do it?" And he's like, "It's actually my bees." So being able to have a mentor that you can see that you can manipulate a hive and not get killed is awesome.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because when you mentioned the intimidation factor, I was, of course, going to mention, well, bees sting, right?
Yep.
So did you have any fear? How easy was that to get over?
So that was one of the main things too, and what you read in the books too is that if you approach it and you're scared, they can sense it. They're big on pheromones, so you have to learn to go in and to be able to control yourself and to be patient. And that was one of the other reasons why I wanted to do it, is because I'm not a very patient person. So I figured this is a hobby where I have to be. I'm forced in this capacity to have to be patient in order to manipulate the hive. So yeah, you just go in, and after watching a couple times, it was just a matter of figuring out exactly what I had to do. And as far as getting stung, I've done it for a couple of years at this point, and the only time that I have gotten stung was when I got a little cocky. I was taking the frames out, and
Could the bee sense that?
Yeah, they must. I mean, ultimately too, when you're trying to take out and get their honey, they don't want you to do that either.
Probably not.
When you manipulate the hive, you wear essentially like big welding gloves. So I was a little clumsy with them, so I took them off, and I was taking a frame out, which is just like one of the pieces with the honeycomb on it, and they didn't like it. So one landed on me and it stung me, and I learned a lesson.
There you go. Always learning. So it sounds like one of the reasons, though, other than just having some amazing honey that you can make for yourself and being a little bit more self-sufficient, is you actually, there's kind of I don't know if I want to say philanthropic, but certainly a larger goal in mind. I mean, I've been shocked the last month or so. I'm doing some research on a number of different issues. I think that's the great thing about this podcast. It kind of makes me, expand, research things. And one of the things I came across was the bee issue and how their populations are dying out. I mean, I think this has been happening for a couple of years now, but certainly it's becoming exacerbated to the point where something needs to be done very, very quickly. I've been hearing some estimates that even 10, 15, 20 years, bee populations could be almost devastated in North America, which would have disastrous consequences for biodiversity, for just growing and cultivating wheat, grain, all the pollen and the flowers that we have. So did your brother help get you into that? I mean, at what level did you think that, like, and we said this kind of jokingly at the outset, but saving the world, but this might actually be an issue where the world is a little bit in peril if we don't get this bee population under control.
Yeah. So my brother kind of instilled like a necessary need to take care of the environment at a young age, and I didn't really know. I mean, ultimately, you can recycle and everything, and that's really beneficial. But at the end of the day, bees are really super necessary. So, I mean, ultimately, you take away the pollination factor, and then you have a couple of years left, and everything else, in theory, dies. So it starts at the bottom of the chain and then works its way up. So it was nice to be able to have him kind of get me into that mindset at an early age, and then I kind of grew into figuring out how I wanted to take my step into it.
And for our listeners who are listening to this and saying, that's kind of cool, and I want to help save the world. Do you have any pieces of advice? What would be the first steps for someone who wants to maybe become a beekeeper? You sound like you referenced the mentorship aspect.
Yep, read a book. I mean, Beekeepers for Dummies. It sounds silly, but there's so much information in that, and it actually takes the fear away from you from reading it. That it's not. It takes the intimidation factor right out of there. And if you are interested in doing it, people love to talk about bees. Beekeepers love to talk about it. So, and I would love to show people as well. And even like Dick Crawford, who's in Morrisonville, he's got hundreds of hives. And I'm a little intimidated when I walk into his scenario because I only have 2 hives consistently. But he's got hundreds of them, and there are tons and tons of bees just floating around. So it can be a little scary, but we like to teach you because we want you to have bees as well.
No, I love that. And I would just advise our listeners, if you haven't, just take a look at some of the things happening around the bee populations. I kind of fell into it a little bit accidentally, in that I've been listening to a lot of Joe Rogan and Tim Ferriss podcasts to kind of figure out what I should be doing better.
Yeah.
And I came across Paul Stamets, who's a mycelium mushroom expert, fungus expert. Are you familiar with Paul Stamets?
Yeah. Well, no, not so much Paul, but the theory on mushrooms is really fascinating as well. I learned that from biology, but mushrooms are really important.
No, I mean, it will blow your mind. And if you guys are not familiar with Paul Stamets, I don't want to nerd out too much here, but please do yourself a favor. One of the TED Talks he had was like how mycelium and fungus are going to help save the world. And in fact, he has a patent that he has on a certain. Again, I'm not a complete expert. You'll have to reference Paul Stamets, and he can tell you. But I believe found some sort of link between mushrooms and their ability to kind of act as biodefense systems to bees. And he very much seems to think that he is on to something incredible as far as saving the bees. And
Yeah, that's
basically,
actually, I believe that 100%.
and what it's doing, essentially, some of these diseases, I believe, they're injected from like other insects get on their back, and so one of the diseases like shrinks the wings of bees, in half, and essentially, obviously, that creates huge problems, and that's one of the reasons we're seeing bee populations die. So what he's doing is apparently saving the world and helping these mycelium create defenses for bees that may help communities thrive. So, but no joke, this is a very serious issue. So for our listeners, take a look at that, and if only for a couple minutes. So let's go back to a little bit more cheery, happy things from talking about the potential destructive end of the world if we can't figure out the bee situation. So the baking.
Yes.
Historically, it sounds like you were really good even as a kid.
Yeah, I always like to experiment with it just to see what I could. My mom always had tons of cookbooks, and she was a pretty good cook when I was a kid. So as I got older, I was home alone a lot while it was the summers and stuff, and my friends weren't really that close all the time. So I learned to kind of cook and go through cookbooks, and I actually started off with I always wanted to just kind of test my limits from the beginning. So one of the first things I experimented with was chocolate souffle, which is a difficult pastry or dessert.
I hear souffles are incredible, like the amount of precision that's needed.
Yeah, yep. And so I was probably 12 when I did that as well, somewhere in that age, but I succeeded. So it was a cool thing to kind of shoot in the dark for, and then I got it. And then I would constantly just make breads and stuff just because I didn't really have anything else to do. And then as this year happened, in the beginning of January, I tend to get bored. So I learn new hobbies a lot and teach myself new things. And
why Waite Innovate, right? Let's figure out something new to do.
So I was kind of interested in baking from before, and then I just wanted to get really good at it. So I just took a couple classes at Michael's, and from there I just did some research, and even honestly, it sounds silly, but Instagram. I watch a lot of Instagram videos, and you can learn new techniques from stuff like that, and it's been really cool. And actually, it's a nice outlet too. So if if I'm stressed out or something, that's my medium for creativity. I cannot do any 2D at all. I cannot draw to save my life. But if you give me clay or a cake, I can tend to build something really cool out of it.
No, interesting. So what are some of your favorite recipes then?
I don't know. I like to mix it up a lot. So over the summer, I made one that was kind of nice. It was a lemon cake with blueberry frosting, and that was just a nice combination. And I like to bring in local like raspberries and stuff into my frostings and bake it into the cake as well and see how it comes out. And I have friends that get to be the guinea pigs on that. So I like to just try to bring in anything that's kind of different as well and blend it in. See how
all right. Has Zach been the beneficiary of any of this?
Yeah, he gets them sometimes.
All right. So it's good to be a friend of Lindsay Boulrice. So
I always get invited to the party.
Yeah, exactly. and do you do any of this it's just kind of a hobby? There's no like website or blogging or anything like that?
If you are interested in one, I will do it for you. It makes me a little nervous for like high pressure ones. I've been asked to do wedding cakes before, and I don't like to do wedding cakes, but birthday cakes, I'm down to do it. So I like to do themed ones.
All right. And as we end up this conversation, let's just get back to the marketing aspect and where can we find some of the amazing work that you're doing with the Z Group? I imagine there's a website.
Yep. So my Facebook is Lindsay Boulrice Realtor, and then my Instagram is Lindsay_bowl of soup. Actually, so
I did come across that, and in fact, we talked about this. There's actually a Twitter, but you don't necessarily like Twitter so much, so I guess we'll just leave it there.
Yeah.
But okay, so. Lindsay Bowl of Soup, and it just makes me think that, of course, as we go into winter, you're going to find some other things to do. Sounds like skiing. Are you a downhill skier?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm not great at it, but I'm working on it. So over the last couple of years, I have friends that are really good at it. So I'm just trying to keep up with them has made me a little bit of a better skier too. So
all right.
That's good.
Any parting pieces of advice to our listeners about either buying a house, baking, or the bee population? Any final thoughts?
I don't know. I guess just if you have questions about any of it, just ask. Don't be afraid to ask people who are good at what they do how to do it. I mean, people who have hobbies and interests like that love to teach other people. And I mean, as far as buying a house, like, don't be intimidated by that. You may be surprised as to like what you're qualified for, your capacity of being able to actually purchase. You may think that you have too much debt and whatever, but that may not actually be the case. So just give it a test run.
Yeah, so I love that, the mentorship aspect. Justin Stearns talked about that a lot. Dina Archer agrees with that. I certainly would. Why wait? Innovate, right? Just if you have an interest, go out and do something. As we talked about, the opportunity cost of reaching out to a mentor is almost nothing. So they say, I'm too busy.
Yeah,
You know?
and you didn't hurt anything. So.
Yeah, find someone else. And I'll tell you, the business community that I've been dealing with and the amount of guests that we've had on, it looks like almost everyone is willing to help out someone and to provide those resources and pieces of advice for people. So I think that's a great bit of advice for our listeners. So once again, thank you so much for joining us, Lindsay.
Thank you for having me.
And for our listeners, once again, thank you for joining Waite Innovate. We would just ask, of course, to check out the website, www.northvolume.com. We also are on Instagram. Our viewers will be able to find us on YouTube. So subscribe, share, like, comment. Basically, we move the community forward, but it takes the community to do that. So if you like what we're talking about, if you think there's something here at North Volume, then reach out to us. Let us know if you have ideas, if you want to advertise here. We've got a great roster of, obviously, people who've been on. And just like, share, keep the conversation going. So thanks again for everyone for joining us, and we'll look forward to having you back on next week's episode of Why Waite Innovate, only on North Volume.